Regard to all the participants who were joining. I wish we could have had an opportunity to meet and interact with each other, but here we are, living in strange times, learning to work remotely, and to evolve strategies to work more effectively while we are not face to face with children or our other colleagues. Today,
You've been unmuted, ma'am. You can go ahead.
Today, I am going to share some of my experiences of working with children with learning disabilities. But before I start on the topic of learning disabilities, I would like very much to set the context for this child, because a child with learning disability is not a child who lives in isolation. He is not a child who is away from everybody else. This is a child who is present in the classroom. This is a child who is there in the school. And this is a child who is part of society. However, it just so happens that this child tends to get left out and that is not counted along with other children. All of you are teachers and deal with many, many children, often 40 children at a time in a classroom. It is not an easy task. In fact, it's one of the most challenging tasks ever. To top it all, it's not just a question of being a big group. This is a group of children where there is a lot of diversity. You see a lot of diversity among children. Children differ on various counts. There are children who have different learning styles. There are children who have different pace of learning. There are children who have certain abilities. And there are also the children who struggle with certain aspects in their learning journey. Some children also require different kinds of support in learning to learn. Within this group of children who require support or face a difficulty perhaps in learning to read, learning to write, learning to spell, or learning to deal with numbers, is also a child who would not be able to understand what is being taught in the way it is being taught, while others around the child are able to pick up and move forward. This child continues to struggle and find it difficult to cope at the same pace. I'm sure all of you can visualize that one child, or perhaps even more than one child in your classroom, who faces these difficulties in learning to read or to write or to spell or to do math or understand whatever you are teaching them. Or you just may feel that this child is different. Different can take on many shades, but different is always a starting point. I believe that I've worked a lot with teachers, and I believe that teachers are amazing because you are so creative in evolving strategies to reach out to all the children and at the same time. I just, for this child who is different, that child may just require that extra bit of support to be able to handle everyday learning tasks. Within this group of children who require that extra support are also children with a learning disability. A child with learning disability is often at a risk of getting isolated or not getting identified. This happens because learning disability is a hidden disability. Hidden because there are no obvious physical manifestations of the disability. So when you meet a child with disability, with learning disability, you're not able to identify a child with learning disability just on the basis of that one meeting. It is only when you work with that child over a period of time that you may pick up certain signs of the child not being able to cope or having some difficulty in his learning abilities and tasks. So before we go into that, the whole aspect of understanding this child better, we need to understand what is learning disability. I'm sure many of you have worked with children with learning disabilities. Would it be possible for you to share some things that come to your mind on what stands out when you see or work with a child with learning disability?
So I'm looking for answers and thoughts from teachers on both the platforms, that's Zoom as well as Facebook. Please uh, allow us a minute for this to be transmitted on Facebook also. There's a minute lag. However, we got an answer from Ms. Neela. Answer is learn differently. The students learn differently in comparison with the regular students. Uh,
Exactly.
Mr. Siddiqui says, I see children don't make an eye contact with the teachers. That's
Okay.
what he believes.
Okay.
Uh, Looking for answers from Facebook. The students write differently.
Okay.
Inconvenience of the child is observed,
Right.
and they learn a concept very slowly. They have difficulty in spelling and reading,
Right.
and also children have mood differences. Yeah, they become very moody perhaps, and there is
Okay.
also a bit of lack of confidence which compounds to all this.
Thank you. Thank you for all your responses. And I think all of them are equally relevant because um, no two children are alike. Every child is different, and every child deals with a difficulty differently, as is true for any of us. You know, we face challenges, and all of us have different reactions to facing that challenge and dealing with those challenges. Similarly, children, the first answer was, I think, learning differently. I think that really sums it up because the important part to remember is the child with learning disability does learn, but learns differently. So how that learning is going to happen will also depend on teaching and teaching differently. And, you know, both the processes of teaching differently and learning differently will go hand in hand. So when we look at learning disability means a difficulty in one or more of the basic processes involved in understanding spoken or written language, and it may show up as a difficulty in reading, writing, spelling, in a person's ability to do math, despite at least average intelligence. So learning disabilities are really conditions that affect the person's ability to write, read, spell, calculate numbers, despite at least average intelligence. This last part of at least average intelligence is something that needs to be clearly really remembered, because a child with learning disability has average to above average intelligence. What you see on your screen now are the three primary characteristics that really define a child or a person with a learning disability. A person with learning disability has average to above average intelligence. In fact, the famous scientists Einstein and Edison are believed to have lived with dyslexia. So that's a clear indicator that it's not for a lack of intelligence. It is for other reasons that the child faces difficulty in being able to read or write or spell. So it is important that the child has average to above average intelligence. The other two uh, primary characteristics that we see are oral and written skills. There's a discrepancy between an oral and written skills, and also a discrepancy between the ability and the achievement of the child. These are things that teachers and parents can easily notice when they work with the child or when they are interacting with the child often. Like a child with, like um, a girl, Anu, whom I'll just call Anu, whom I worked with, she was very good at answering questions orally in class. But when she was asked to write the same answer, she was not able to do it. She really struggled at writing the same answer. For a teacher, it can be like working with two different children. The same discrepancy is seen between the ability and the achievement of a child. As a teacher, you may find that one child in the class whom you feel has a lot of ability, has the potential, but is for some reason unable to achieve that potential. He's not able to match that potential. So, what you see, unfortunately, our system of education is designed on marks and on primarily on the written assignments and written tests, where a lot of children with learning disabilities struggle. So, when you are dealing with children, it sometimes puzzles you as to why that child in the class has the ability, you can recognize the ability, yet the child is unable to achieve or match that potential. So these three characteristics are really the 3 points where you can actually do a preliminary kind of an identification of a child. I'm not saying that it's an assessment or it can, you can use it to label a child as being a child with learning disability, but these can really be pointers because it'll set you thinking on whether the child has a difficulty in his learning. While we look at learning disability, it is equally important to understand what learning disability is not. Learning disability is not the same as a learning difficulty which results out of an intellectual or a developmental disability. Nor is it a difficulty that arises out of emotional, vision, hearing, or motor skill development. A child with intellectual disability would have difficulties in learning to read, write, spell, or even understand. But the reasons for that are based totally in are totally linked to the intellectual disability, and it is not a learning disability. It is important again to reiterate the fact that the child with learning disability does not have below average intelligence. This is a child who has average and even very high intelligence levels. Similarly, when you find a child who has a vision difficulty or a hearing difficulty, those children will also face difficulties in their reading or the writing or picking up skills linked to their academic work. However, the reasons for that stem from the sensory difficulties that they face. So it is important when we look at or assess a child for a learning disability, these 2 points are the first two areas that are ruled out, because you need to be sure that the learning difficulty that the child is facing are not, those difficulties are not arising due to an intellectual or a sensory difficulty. Some other factors which are probably specific to our context include first generation learners and exposure to the language. Um, a lot of classrooms have children who are first generation learners. And when the medium of instruction is English in a classroom, these children probably have no exposure to the language. When they come to the school, that is the first exposure they get to English. And when everything is being taught in a language which is kind of alien to them, it makes that learning process very difficult for them. So the reason I'm pointing out these factors is that, sometimes there are mistakes, or, there's that over labeling or over generalizing and over identification that happens. So that danger remains. So it is important to factor in these points and see whether the child is unable to read or spell or write or comprehend because he has difficulties working with the language itself. So the check for that is try and see whether the child is able to do better when he is taught in the language he is familiar with. So suppose the child comes from a Hindi speaking family, ask the child questions in Hindi. See what is his, uh, how is he responding to whatever is being taught? Is he able to comprehend the text? Is he able to answer questions? Is he able to write answers? And if you see a difference between what he does in English and Hindi, just as an example, you will be able to kind of narrow it down and say that this child faces difficulties because there is that difficulty or that lack of exposure to the language. Because it's also important to remember where children are first generation learners, or the language spoken at home is not English, the child's exposure to the language is only limited to the few hours that he spends in school. He does not get that exposure to the language at home. So again, you will need to look at these things. The other point is on learning opportunities. Sometimes children with disabilities specifically have long absences from school. It could be due to a medical reason, or it could be for other reasons. When that gap in schooling happens, the child faces difficulty and in keeping pace with what is being taught in school. And when that gap really grows, then it becomes even more challenging for the child to cope and keep pace. So these factors also need to be kept in mind when we are looking at identification of children with learning disabilities. Two questions that are always asked by parents. One, what causes learning disability? And the second, which is always uppermost in the minds, is does a learning disability go away? So when we look at causes of learning disabilities, there is really no agreement on any one exact cause that leads to a learning disability. However, images of the brain that have been taken over a period of time show that brain of a child or a person with learning disability develops and functions differently. It is often said that the brain of a child or a person with learning disability is wired differently. So again, it is not something that the child is cooking up. It is something to do with how he's receiving information. Neuroevidence also shows that it is not a difficulty that is stemming from a single area of the brain or a specific area of a brain, but it is to do with difficulties in bringing together that information from different regions of the brain. This impacts how the information is processed by the brain and thus causes difficulty for the child in his attempts towards learning. The second question, which is always the first question that parents ask, does a learning disability go away? Unfortunately, the answer is no. A learning disability does not go away. There is no cure for a learning disability. However, when I interact with parents, I always share positive stories, journeys of children I have worked with. Children who have now grown up into independent, confident adults. They have all taken different paths, struggled along the paths, but they have found their own path. They have created their own path. And it is important for parents who are totally stressed when they see their child struggle at school. They seem to see no light at an endless dark, at the end of an endless dark tunnel. So somewhere it is important for parents to know that there are other children who have walked the path, who have had learning disabilities, who have struggled in school, but they have learned along the way. They have learned because they have received the supports. Because what helps a child with a learning disability is receiving the right kind of support and receiving it at the right time. The extent to which it'll help will depend on the kind of supports the child has received, both from the school as well as from the home, and how the child has learned to incorporate whatever he is being taught in learning how to learn. So, how do you ensure that the child gets the right supports at the right time? Well, there is only one way, and that is to ensure that you are able to identify the child as early as possible. While a formal assessment of a learning disability can only be done it can never be done before the age of 6 or 7, because uh, learning disability is to do with difficulties in learning to read, write, spell, maths, and all these skills are only taught, or the child is able to deal with them only by the age of 6 and 7. So an assessment that involves looking at his abilities to handle reading, writing, spelling, math can only be done by the age of 6 or 7 at the earliest. However, there are certain early warning signs. These are signs which can be um, looked at by teachers and by parents. Dr. Hornsby is a pioneer in the field of learning disability, and she established the Dyslexia Center in London. She has given a list of early warning signs, both at the preschool or the nursery stage, as well as at the formal school age, which is age 5 and above. Before we look at this, I'd just like to say that this is not an assessment tool. This is not even a checklist. These are just points that can help all of us as teachers or as parents to be able to focus our attention and observe the child in a more formal or a systematic way. Some of the early warning signs that Dr. Hornsby has listed for the child who is in the nursery or preschool level include poor attention development. Teachers in play school or in nursery will find that there are some children who are just not able to pay attention to tasks. So even simple tasks like coloring within a line, or just tracing a pattern, or doing some play activity, or molding a piece of Play-Doh, those things are difficult for the child to complete. The child is unable to pay a lot of attention to that. A child who has delayed speech and language, or a child who is prone to colds, earaches, leading to intermittent hearing loss. Both these factors of speech and language and regular persistent colds leading to intermittent hearing loss will impact the way the child is learning letter sound association, because that forms the base for reading. If those things are not addressed early on, the child will struggle when formal reading begins. Vision difficulties. Very often, parents say that my child is unable to copy from the board or copy correctly from the book. Rather than jumping towards learning disability, or imagining that the child has other difficulties, the first thing you need to look at is whether the child is seeing correctly. Is he able to see the board? Is he able to see the book? So vision difficulties need to be kind of checked before we look at learning disabilities. There are some children who are poor at learning nursery rhymes, while all the other children are able to learn the nursery rhyme and do other activities like learning the sequence of letters and letters in an alphabet. This child would struggle with learning nursery rhymes. And you'll often find children with learning disabilities just mumbling their way through a nursery rhyme because they are not clear about the words, or they are not clear about the sequence. So their lines or the words will go here and there. Lack of interest in books and print. I think it's a very natural human tendency. We tend to shun whatever we find difficult. So a child who at an early age finds reading or just print difficult to deal with would opt for other things, like probably a toy or doing some work with his hands or doing some art and craft activity, rather than look at a book or flick through a book. As a child grows up and enters the formal school age, around age 5 onwards, if the child shows unexpected difficulty with the acquisition and development of literacy skills, which are not in sync with the child's intelligence, you need to look closely. You need to pay close attention to find out the reasons behind that. If the child shows difficulty in learning everyday sequences, there are a lot of children I've worked with who, even in class 6, are unable to tell you the sequence of the days in a week or name the months in a year. They just find it too overwhelming. And especially with months, they won't be able to give you all 12 months. It won't be in sequence and it won't be all there. Sequencing is an area that is very difficult for some children with learning disabilities. I'm saying some because, like I said earlier, no two children are alike, and that holds true for any children with learning disabilities as well. You'll find that every child with a learning disability will present a different aspect, would have different challenges, and would work differently. So most kids face difficulties in sequencing. It could be sequencing of instructions also. And this will play out when an instruction is given in a classroom or at home. The child is asked to do two things, and the child is not able to figure out what comes first and what comes next, and would muddle up the sequence. Difficulty breaking down words into their constituent sounds. Letter sound association is very, very difficult for children. And that is why when we teach reading or spelling, we do it the phonetic way. Teaching the child the letter sound association is the basis for teaching the child how to read and spell. So the child will be unable to break up a word like cat into the three sounds that make up the word cat. Distractibility and poor attention. I'm going to talk about this a little later and link the two things of how poor attention, distractibility, and challenging behavior all come together. A child who shows poor coordination or is clumsy. I'm sure all of you must have seen children in the class, some children in the classroom who are constantly dropping things. You know, things are falling off their desk, their bags are all over the place, their books are here and there. And when they're asked to pick up something, they just go all over the place. Children who have immature pencil grip or poor handwriting. Children who have uncoordinated movement and difficulty with exercises and games. Quite a few children with learning disabilities find it very difficult to play with the play activities or games, you know. Even catching, throwing a ball is a difficult task for that child because you have to estimate where the ball is coming, how to catch it. All those things sometimes become a difficult activity for the child. Poor concept of time and just a general disorganization around them. Child who keeps his head too close to the page, or there's poor presentation of work on the paper, um, not being able to stick to lines, so work is running all over when he's writing, work is running all over. Left-right confusion and general difficulty with direction. Now this can happen, the left-right confusion can happen both with hands. A lot of children with learning disability that I worked with have had a lot of difficulty in deciding which hand to use, whether to use the right hand or the left hand. That hand preference, that ability to determine that hand preference takes a while to happen. They are unable to tell you whether this is their left hand or their right hand. And the left-right confusion also translates when you learn to read or write. Another thing to remember when you're talking about hand preferences, a lot of parents who've had children who have opted to write with their left hand insist that the child uses their right hand to write with. And it is always advised never to mess with that because it really messes with the way the child learns and thinks and writes. So if the child opts to write with his left hand, please do let him continue using his left hand. This is a sample of a child who has made two sentences using the word you and for, and off he got lost with. So in that first line, you see that he's written, you was a bad boy. If you look at the letter B in the word bad, you will find that it goes this way and that way. And this reflects that confusion between left and right. So he's basically leaving it up to you as a teacher to decide whether he's written it correctly. And you find this a lot with children who have left-right confusion. Speech and language difficulties. Difficulty in pronouncing certain words or certain sounds, delayed or disordered articulation, difficulty pronouncing multisyllabic words. So a word like remember, for instance, the child may just miss out one part of it and go remember, or find another way of saying the word remember, missing out some part of it. Poor vocabulary, short, immature sentences, like you saw in the sample before, long, rambling sentences, which are disconnected or poorly sequenced. So when you look at poor vocabulary and short, immature sentences, again, even with older children who are probably in class 8, I worked with a child, I'll just call him Abhishek, um, who would, even in class 8, make sentences like, I had fun, or I had a good time. And that was his sentence. But when he would make a sentence orally, he would use more words, a longer sentence, use more words and make longer sentences. But when it came to writing, they became shorter and shorter. But his vocabulary bank was also limited. Again, it becomes a vicious cycle because children who find reading difficult and do not have somebody who can read to them often will have a limited vocabulary. And this will reflect in their work when they make sentences, because those sentences will be short and use words which are not age appropriate. The example for long rambling sentences, disconnected, poorly sequenced, is this. You find this child who has written, I've just showed the first page, but this story continued. He was writing a story based on some text he had read, and he was taking that story forward. And you can see that there are spelling errors. Some places it's just not making too much sense. And as he continued, there were no punctuation marks. So it was just 2 pages of words which just went on without a full stop, without a capital. And when the child was asked to read this, he himself lost track of what he was trying to say. Because when the child starts reading or explaining what he meant, it's always like, oh, I meant to write this first. No, but this happened first, and then this happened. So the whole sequence of events gets disorganized, and the child just gets caught and continues. Some children face short-term memory difficulties, display challenging behavior. These are the 2 points I want to focus a little more on. In a classroom, as a teacher, if you've given an instruction saying, take out your English books, open chapter 3, page 21. For a child with learning disability who also has short-term memory difficulties, he's not had the time to take in all 3 things together. So he may take out his English book and he may miss out what else was being said, and he just may reverse the number order and open another page, probably open page 12. Then he'll look around and see the child sitting next to him has something else open on his desk. And he looks left and he sees the same thing, that his page is looking different. So he's unable to figure it out. He starts asking what to do. Why is which page is this? What should I do? And that becomes seen as a disruptive behavior in a classroom. I know it is difficult for teachers to manage that one child who starts talking suddenly, because it disrupts everybody's attention and flow. But this child is just trying to figure out what to do and how he can be on the same page as everyone else. If the child's difficulties get recognized early in life, and the child is understood by others around him, people who matter, like parents and teachers and peers, the child is better able to learn how to learn. He or she gets the supports that they require, and they settle down faster. However, a child who does not get identified early in life will face a lot of difficulties. He will try and reach out to parents and teachers and say, I can't do it. But he may not be able to say it in as many words. That is when he starts playing up and he'll just start talking or walking when wanting to go out and take a break or wanting to do something which is not important, but he just wants to get away from that situation. So, when we talk about challenging behavior, it is important to remember that we need to really pay close attention to this child and ask, why is this challenging behavior being displayed? What are the reasons behind it? So, we need to really investigate that and understand the child better. Once a child has been kind of identified, whether it is by parents or by teachers. And often teachers are the ones who are able to identify the child. And it is not about when we say identifying, it does not mean that you are giving a formal diagnosis, but you are just raising a red flag and saying maybe this child is a child with learning disability, or if it's a very young child, you will just raise the red flag and say this is a child who is at risk of developing a learning disability. So we need to get a formal diagnosis before we start working with the child in a formal way, in a formal setup. So for that, you need to refer the child for an assessment. Formal assessments are only done after the age of 6 or 7 years. It is important to remember that a child should only be assessed if, as parents or as teachers, you feel that the difficulties the child is facing are persisting over a period of time, despite the child having received regular learning inputs. It is important to remember that, because if the child has not had the learning inputs, has not been regular in school, has not had the learning opportunities that other children in his class have had, this child will not be at par with others. An assessment is only done in a formal setup, which may be a child guidance center or a center which is authorized and recognized to conduct assessments. In most cities, if your school follows the CBSE board, the CBSE authorizes certain centers to conduct assessments. An assessment is conducted by a team of professionals, which includes a clinical psychologist. A clinical psychologist does a test of intelligence to rule out the factor of intelligence in terms of like we did about talked about the primary characteristics. A child who has average to above average intelligence is and is unable to read, write, spell, that child can be seen as a child with learning disability. But if his IQ score or his intelligence level is below average, then the child is not seen as a child with learning disabilities. An assessment, it's very important to see that the assessment is done in a child-friendly center with trained professionals who are sensitive to children and the needs of children and are able to spend some time to establish a rapport with the child. Because there are centers and centers. Some centers conduct an assessment within an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, but done in the same time span. There are other centers where assessments are spread over a couple of days. They may be done over a period of 10 days, where the child is coming in for specific sessions and doing different subjects or doing different activities with the team of professionals. I opt for the latter, where the assessment is done over a period of time. Because one-off session can lead to difficulties. Suppose I am asked to go and give a test, and I am tired, I am sleepy, I am not in the mood to work. I will not perform to my optimum. I've had a child who came to me and he said, I went for this I went to some place where this lady asked me a whole lot of questions. I answered some, then I was tired, and I refused to answer. And you can't blame that child. You can't really argue with that logic, because a child requires that time. He needs to know why you are asking that question. He needs to know that person who is asking the question. So where assessments are done and how assessments are done are very, very important. Because if an assessment is spread over a period of time, you'll get a better picture of the child. Parents often wonder whether they should share that information about assessment and the process with the child, while the decision is entirely the parents, and they decide whether to or not to. But when they ask for my advice, I always feel that it is best to let the child know, because finally it is the child who has to go through that whole process of assessment. So information must be shared with the child, but must be shared in an age appropriate way. You can't be using technical terms with a 7-year-old. So you need to make that assessment come alive for the child, and you share that information and you put the child at some ease so that the child is not frazzled when the assessment actually happens. What is an assessment done for? What is the reason behind an assessment? Well, an assessment really should be done. Ideally, it should be done to see what are the areas of strength, what are the areas where the child faces difficulties and needs support. It should also be able to identify the ways in which the child is able to learn, and identify or recommend some strategies in helping that child learning to learn. An assessment should not be done for the purpose of labeling. It should not be done to exclude the child from regular classroom activities. In fact, in my interaction with parents, I've had a lot of parents who are hesitant to share assessment reports with schools, because if they don't have a comfort zone there, they don't have a comfortable relationship with the school, with the teacher, with the heads of schools, they always worry whether they will be asked to shift the child from a regular class to learning center, or just be asked to move the child to a special school. None of this is necessary, by the way. But these are worries in the minds of parents. And an assessment should definitely not be used or misused in this fashion to isolate the child. Because remember, the child is already isolated in many ways from many activities. I'll tell you a happy story about a child I worked with. I'm going to call him Abhay, and I'm not sharing his real name because I want to respect his privacy and maintain the confidentiality. When I worked with Abhay, I was working with a school here in Chandigarh where Abhay was in class 3. And instead of working directly with the child, I had formulated a strategy whereby I would work with the teacher and work along with her in working with the child. And in this process, we made sure that the child really never knew that I was working with the child indirectly, because of the stigma attached to a learning disability or labels per se. Abhay was in class 3, super bright, very amazing memory he had, and he was very, very articulate. He was able to actually remember, he had a because he had a super memory, he was actually able to go home and share with his parents verbatim all the discussions that happened around a certain topic in class. But when it came to reading or writing, Abhay really struggled. He was just not able to read. He found it difficult even to read simple sentences, which included words like the and you and cat. What he did was very interesting because I sat in the class and observed from a distance. While the teacher was reading aloud, Abhi took a book and pencil in his hand and he tracked along. As the teacher read slowly, he tracked each word, giving the impression that he was reading along, while the reality was that he was unable to read even a single word there. But he was taking all that information in. He would track along and put a slash where the teacher stopped. The teacher encouraged him to participate in classroom activities by asking him questions. Because his oral skills were very good, he was far beyond years when it came to oral skills, vocabulary, the kind of sentences he made, and his expressive language skills were far beyond his age level. This was a strategy used by the teacher to enable him to get equal opportunity and to participate in the classroom. So Abhay would be asked and encouraged to answer questions orally. Abhay also had difficulties when it came to maths. He was very good at maths. Mental maths was excellent. He would calculate sums mentally and give you the correct answer. But his difficulty lay in copying the sum from the board. So if the teacher had written a sum on the board, unless somebody copied it for him, he was unable to solve it. So either somebody wrote the sum for him in his notebook, or the teacher would just give him a worksheet. I think I just got carried away because this was a question I wanted to ask you. What strategies would you suggest for a child like Abhay in your class?
So looking for answers on both the platforms. But ma'am, while you're narrating the story, there were a lot of thoughts that were shared on Facebook. So
Okay,
there is some thoughts that I would like to perhaps read out
sure.
on Facebook. Yes, these students have one or other strategies that a teacher can help that the child. They want the student to be identified of his strength and work vis-a-vis the strength. Another teacher suggests that a student needs a buddy with him,
Yes.
a mate or a buddy. And
Yes.
there is another ma'am who says if he is good with oral activities, perhaps that is something that we need to, develop rather than thinking about writing. And peer learning is another suggestion. Then you can also allow them to record.
Yes.
In the age of technology, perhaps these are easy to do. And
Yes.
uh, also, we should not stop at uh, these activities. We should also try to encourage the child, is what Ms. Savina Daniel says, and usage of computers to help us oral language to text, because we've got technology, so we can use softwares. So this will also help him boost his self-confidence if we pair him with a buddy. So the suggestion of buddy, I think, is overwhelming
Okay.
in both the platforms.
Thank you so much. Thank you, all of you, for writing in and sharing your strategies and thoughts on this. Yes, some of the strategies I'd also like to, before I share some of the strategies that we um, worked out for Abhay, um, I would also like to say that this was in the pre-iPad era. So we did not have access to computers and laptops that easily in classroom situations as is possible today. So yes, computers, using computers is a very good idea. And especially with children with, I mean, I'm just kind of diversifying, but children with vision impairment are allowed the use of a laptop in regular classrooms in Delhi. In some of the private schools, they are allowed the usage of laptops, which makes things easier for them because they are more independent. And like you pointed out, one of the teachers, ma'ams, has pointed out that confidence, that's an extremely important element in all this, because once the child learns the skills and learns to be independent and is able to do things on his or her own, that confidence level really spikes. And that is what you really want. That you want the child to have the confidence in himself and develop a good self-esteem. Coming back to the strategies, for Abhay, what we did was, yes, like you suggested, the buddy system. And what was very interesting was that the teacher did not share with the class that these are the children who require support or require buddies. She just posed a question to the class, and this was a class of 30 students, and she said, um, there are some children in our class who require support for different things, different activities, different subjects. Would any of you like to volunteer? And the most beautiful thing happened. All 30 hands shot up, including Abhay's, because he wanted to participate. He wanted to share whatever he could and support others in whatever way he could. It is important to remember that a child, whether with a learning disability or any other disability, does not want to be a receiver all the time. That child also wants to contribute because he has a lot of strengths. We only unfortunately see the difficulties that the child faces, but there are a whole lot of strengths. There are a whole lot of positives in that child, as in every other child or any other human being. So we need to recognize those strengths and try and encourage that child to further those strengths in his quest for learning. For Abhay, we decided to have a buddy who would help him in different subjects. So different buddies were kind of a roster was created that different buddies would help Abhay for different subjects on different days. So, for instance, we had a child who was very, very good at maths and was able to finish his work really quickly. So he was asked to finish his work and then come and um, either write down the sum for Abhay so that he could uh, solve it, or if it was a word problem, because Abhay faced a lot of difficulties when it came to word problems, and he always thought that they were created specially to irritate him because he just wasn't able to read the sum, and somebody was required. The buddy would just read out the sum and read it slowly so that Abhay got time to sequence it. Because when you're doing it mentally, you need time to put that information together and work out the sequence. Okay, it may have 3 steps or 2 steps to it. So what to do first and what comes next, that has to be worked out. So that buddy would help him in his math. Another child would probably help him when he had to write an answer on. So what he would do is dictate the answer and the other child would write for him. The teacher would also help Abhay at whenever assignments were to be submitted or a test came up, because Abhay found it difficult to write, so his work would never reflect his ability if it was done purely on the basis of what he had written. So Abhay was encouraged to give oral tests, and he was marked on the basis of that. Like you said, recording, that is a strategy that is used in some places, but in some schools they find it distracting for other children. So I think strategies are some things that teachers are best equipped to work out, because they know the reality of their classroom, and they know that what would work for this child and with how it would impact the other children. Because as a teacher who is reaching out to 40 children, you can't just focus on that one child. You have to look at the other 39 also. And you may have more than one child with support needs. So you need to work out strategies accordingly. Um, what was another area that Abhay really excelled in was creative writing, but it was creative writing with a twist. He would dictate his stories and his parents would write them for him. And I had the privilege of reading some of his stories. They were amazing. They were far beyond his age, and they had different elements. It had a touch of humor, sense of mystery, and he had an amazing vocabulary. So he kind of wove all those things, elements, and words in to make a story really, really enjoyable. And his stories always ended in a twist, so it made it more engrossing and enjoyable. Talking of learning disabilities, we also need to remember that there are different types of learning disabilities. Like Mr. Siddiqui mentioned, we will be covering the types of learning disabilities in detail in the next session. However, just to give an introduction to this, learning disabilities is really an umbrella term. And within this come the specific learning disabilities. We're going to focus on the three specific learning disabilities, which are dyslexia, dyscalculia, and dysgraphia. Dyslexia is a difficulty faced while reading. Dyscalculia is a difficulty in math, and dysgraphia is a difficulty with writing. So these learning disabilities, specific learning disabilities, will be covered in detail the next time. A lot of the questions that have come in pertain to different types of learning disabilities and the kind of difficulties faced by a child with dyslexia and the kind of teaching strategies. All that will be addressed hopefully in the next session. So learning disability is really a category containing many specific learning disabilities, and all of them cause learning to be difficult. A person can also have more than just one difficulty. So a child may have dyslexia as well as dyscalculia. A child, Anu, whom I worked with, had extreme difficulties in reading and writing and spelling, and also struggled with her math. So you can have a combination of just more than one specific learning disability. Though I put this right at the end of my presentation, but the child is really the most important person in all this. Because the child always comes first. We need to, as teachers, recognize the strengths. We need to praise and encourage the child. Remember, this is a child who is always constantly hearing the word no. You're not able to do this, don't do this, you're not paying attention. So he's always hearing a negative. It is not right to only focus on the difficulties. So you need to look and recognize the strengths. Keep an eye out for this child. Support the child. In fact, one of the questions sent in by Seema Verma ma'am which I really loved, was how can I become the child's favorite teacher? And I think these are some of the ways in which you can reach out and support the child. Keeping an eye out for the child, supporting the child so that the child is included to participate in activities. I had a child whom I worked with, and I'll call her Rima. I asked Rima one day to tell me her day, tell me about her day at school. And she started by saying that I got up and I did not want to go to school, but my parents insisted that I have to, and there's no way that I could stay back. And I went, I got ready, I got to the bus stop, I got onto the bus, and nobody allowed me to sit with me. They didn't allow me to sit with them. I got to school, I wasn't allowed to sit with any child. They said, no, you go and find some other place to sit. So I sat alone. Nobody talked to me. During recess, again, I tried to join other girls to play with them or spend time with them, talk to them, but nobody would talk to me. One child even told me that my parents have asked me not to talk to children who are not doing well in school. Imagine a class 3 student telling you this. She was told to her face that others did not want to talk to her and they had been told not to talk to her. With the result, she spent the entire day all alone. Nobody spoke to her, nobody played with her, nobody included her. When you think of Rima, as a teacher, you need to be alert to this. You need to be alert to the fact that children often get isolated, and that is where your support as a teacher needs to come in. Remember that these children face many challenges at home, in school, vis-a-vis their peers, and they encounter these challenges far beyond their years. So, as teachers, we can reassure them that we understand the challenges they face, reassure them and support them at all times, meeting the challenges and overcoming them. Many children who continue to face challenges get isolated, develop low levels of confidence, and are at risk of developing a low self-esteem. We need to understand and support them at all times. Many children, especially those who are younger, cannot express themselves or share their feelings. What they can do is plays out as what is called challenging behavior or rebellious behavior. Actually, this is only a shout out for help and support. So we need to watch out for that child in the class who is constantly showing this, what is called challenging behavior. We need to sit with that child, take out time, invest in that child so that the child is able to share what he is going through. We need to remember that the child is a key person in the team, and any program that is developed has to be in partnership. So the teachers, special educators, parents, and the child all need to be on the same page for any program or any strategy to be effective. Make sure that the child receives the support as a right. It's not charity, it is a right. Ensure and extend respect, dignity, privacy, equal opportunities, and create spaces where the child feels safe, and become that person if you can, in whom the child can come and confide. Keep their faith. Don't let in. Don't share whatever the child has shared with others, because the child will come to know. So you need to keep that faith. Most important, believe in them. There was a child who came in, he would constantly tell his mother that whenever I try to read, the letters start dancing. everybody would laugh at him. It was only Tare Zameen Par where they actually showed that visual of the child trying to read and the letters were dancing. That, when this child saw this movie with his parents and came back the next day and he says, ma'am, now my mother understands what I meant when I said letters were dancing. His mother had no words, obviously. She just couldn't believe it. And, so you need to believe. When the child comes and says, ma'am, let us dance when I try to read, you need to believe them, because nobody wants to not do well. Nobody wants to be singled out. Nobody wants to be at the receiving end of a punishment. So really need to earn the trust of children.
Great thoughts, man. Great thoughts.
So I end with that. And
And yes, thank you so much for the thoughts. In fact, your case studies were reflections of a person on the ground who has understood people by working with them rather than theoretically, trying to understand people. So these were wonderful thoughts, and I see a lot of people even after 1 hour and 15 minutes, they're still there are about 400 teachers and parents who are stuck who are actually attentive to the session even now. Yeah, so great. Thanks for your attention span. Thanks to the interest, because most of your mothers also being teachers. So we've got three questions. Courtesy the time paucity in time, we will only be taking three questions, but I'm sure, ma'am, you'll be happy to answer them
sure.
with your permission. Yes, and
Yes.
the first question is relevant to everyone over here. The question is, how do we cope with the children during the psychological effects on children during COVID-19 and how to cope up with that now? Your thoughts?
I think a child with learning disability is the same as any other child. So whatever strategies we evolve, whatever worries and concerns we have for all children apply equally to this child with learning disabilities. And probably what we can do as an added measure is to ensure that the child is able to continue confiding in that one person or sharing what he's going through with that one person, whether it's the school class teacher or special educator in school or whoever else he has developed or established a rapport with, to be able to be given the opportunity to be able to reach out and connect with that person.
Okay. The next question is from a very concerned mother. For the reasons of privacy, I'm not going to reveal her name.
Right.
However, I shall read a question. Ma'am, I have a child who is of 11 years. He is very naughty at home, but in school he is not. He doesn't open up. And after assessment, we find that he has a learning disability. So, what should I do?
Well, if the child has been assessed as having a learning disability, ma'am, I would suggest that you get in touch with the school, the class teacher, and work out strategies on how that child can be helped. If there is a special educator in school, uh, the special educator can help design a program for that child and address the difficulties the child is facing. So if the child has difficulty in reading, a reading program can be started off. Because the child is 11, it is early years, so the child would be able to work on whatever areas that need working on.
So, ma'am also would like to contact you. We'll try to help ma'am contact you.
Sure.
That's one thing. And the last question for this evening to both the viewers on Zoom and Facebook, all the attentive viewers. Uh, this is a question, and I shall again not reveal the name of the parent and the teacher.
Sure.
Ma'am, I have a question. My child is 10 years old. He is very naughty at home, but in school, he doesn't open up, even if he knows the answer. I guess it is a phobia. What should I do?
Um, well, you would need to see whether what are the, you need to kind of basically, I think, talk to the child and find out the reasons. Some children are shy when they are in larger groups. Homes are safe spaces for children and they can just be themselves. So sometimes they are a little more intimidated when it comes to public spaces or being in school, being with other children. Sometimes there is also that comparison with other children. Uh, Children may laugh. That is always a worry children have, that if I don't give the right answer, others may laugh at me. So reassuring, I think, talking to the teacher and working out strategies whereby this child can be encouraged to participate in classroom activities and also be kind of put at ease with the fact that, you know, even if you give a wrong answer, it's all right. It's not the end of the world. So somewhere some strategies will need to be worked out um, with the teacher, but most importantly, talk to the child and try and find out the reasons why he is so quiet, and you'll find many answers there.
Thank you so much for that answer, ma'am. And I think though we have a lot of questions on Facebook, I think we will uh, uh, collate the questions and pass it on to man, and man could answer it in the next session. However, for this evening, we would like to, on behalf of Colin's Learning, thank man and also thank all the attendees, all the participants whom you've left in rapt attention. So we still, after 1 hour and 40 minutes, have about 400 participants. Uh, that is all to you, man. And thank you so much. And wish you all a happy weekend. Stay safe. Please do stay safe.
Thank you so much.